Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody. The issue of moral ambition has become, if not controversial, certainly a hot talking point in the last few weeks. The Dutch-based social philosopher Rutgers Bregman has a new book out on moral ambition, appropriately called Moral Ambition: How to Stop Wasting Your Talent and Start Making a Difference. I've known Bregman for a while. In fact, I knew him before he was famous. And he's certainly perhaps a model of someone who's dedicated his life to improving the world, in however we define improving the world. In Moral Ambition and some of his work, he picks out Thomas Clarkson, the 19th century English abolitionist, as the model, or certainly as a model of a man whose life was committed to moral ambition. But one could perhaps equally use the life of the American abolitionist and politician Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner, of course, is best known in some ways for being bloodily bludgeoned on the floor of the US Senate by a supporter of slavery. And I'm thrilled that Sumner now has a new biographer. Zaakir Tameez has a new book out. He's a young man. He just graduated from Yale Law School. And he has a new book called Charles Sumner, Conscience of a Nation. And Zaakir is joining us from Houston, Texas. Zaakir, would it be fair to describe Sumner as a model, if not the model, of moral ambition?
I would say that's right, Andrew. Thank you very much for having me. What struck me about Charles Sumner's life is that he had gone to Harvard for undergrad and then for law school at Harvard. He becomes a protege of Joseph Story, who was kind of the most famous Supreme Court justice alive, or the second most famous justice alive at the time. And he kind of has this whole career laid out for him as a corporate lawyer in Boston. He's kind of set up to be the next Dane professor of law at Harvard Law School. And then what he does is that he sort of throws it all away in order to fight for racial justice. And it's a striking story that actually, the story that I came across when I first learned about, thought about this book project, which is that in 1849, he's around 38 years old. He's got this law practice, and this young black attorney named Robert Morris, who's 26, my age, walks into his office and asked him to join him in representing a 5-year-old black girl who wanted to go to a white-only school. And so Sumner teams up with Morris, and they argue a case in the Massachusetts Supreme Court trying to integrate schools in Boston. So more than 100 years before racial integration became the law of the land at the United States Supreme Court in our schools. And so it's just such a striking thing of him using his talents, the way Bregman describes, to fight the right fight, to advance social change, and to use his talents in a way that to make society better rather than just becoming another corporate lawyer or another professor.
It's probably a little autobiography there, Zaakir, maybe we'll come to later, since you're a recent graduate of Yale Law School. Some people might say, well, it was very easy back in the 19th century if one had moral ambition, to borrow Bregman's term, to focus on the issue of slavery. Do you think that's fair? When we look back, things always seem simpler.
Sure, I think some people will just assume if you live in the North, you're anti-slavery. If you live in the South, you're pro-slavery. In the period before the Civil War, and it's much more complex than that. So let me paint you a picture of the Boston that Charles Sumner grew up in. So Boston at this time is a city that, yes, is teeming with abolitionists, but it's also a city that is based on the textile industry. It's the largest industry in the city in Massachusetts, really. The textile industry is fed by Southern cotton. And so by the time Sumner is in early adulthood, his best friend, Henry Longfellow's father-in-law was a man named Nathan Appleton, who helped to bring textiles to America. He took it from Great Britain, who helped to create these alliances with Southern slavocrats across the country to kind of expand the slave trade and to expand the cotton trade. His other best friend, Francis Lieber, leaves Boston and goes to South Carolina, becomes a professor at South Carolina College and a slaveholder. His teacher, Joseph Story, writes Prigg versus Pennsylvania, which is one of the most pro-slavery Supreme Court decisions of all time. So his environment, even though he's living in Boston, is that he's surrounded by people who are pro-slavery, surrounded by people who have economic investments, who have academic investments, intellectual investments in the slave system. And for him to speak out for abolition cost him everything in his social career. So he has one quote where he was walking down Beacon Street, which is one of the most prestigious streets in the city of Boston, where a lot of the aristocrats, and they were called the Boston Brahmins, used to live. And he said that there once every door in this street was open to me, and now not a single one is.
He grew up, if not in poverty, certainly not in that aristocratic environment. His parents were, at least according to Wikipedia, were born in poverty. Is that one of the reasons, do you think, that Sumner was able to, so to speak, sacrifice his self-interest in the cause of abolitionism?
So what's striking is that his parents were too poor to live in any of the.
Yeah, and he grew up on Beacon Hill on Irving Street. Which
so Bostonians today will assume that Beacon Hill is kind of the posh neighborhood in Boston, and really it was only the south slope of Beacon Hill that was the posh slope. The north slope of Beacon Hill, facing the Charles River, was where a lot of poor white and black families lived. So Sumner, where he was born, was only a block away from the African Meeting House, which was one of the first black churches in American history. He was only a few blocks away from the Black Freemasonic Lodge. So as a child, as he's walking around in Beacon Hill, he is seeing black businesses. He's seeing black men and women walking the streets. He may have played with black kids as a kid, for all we know. And so from a young age, he kind of had this sensibility that he and his African-American neighbors were equal, that they were just human beings. And that sensibility is something he took with him as he grew older.
Zaakir, some people, when we discuss the morality or lack of morality of 19th century America, will, if not defend, certainly excuse the people who turned a blind eye to slavery by saying, well, everyone kind of believed in it then. It was complicated. There was the North, there was the South, there was the cotton industry. Is that a moral excuse for the many white Northerners, unlike Charles Sumner, who didn't take a stand on this stuff?
I agree with you that we should judge historical figures as men of their times. We shouldn't judge them by the standards of today. We should judge them by the standards of their own times. And if we judge slaveholders by the standards of Sumner's era, they were characterized as just as evil and barbaric as many of us would say today. So Charles Sumner, for example, right, living at the same time as Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, or as Stonewall Jackson, living in the same era as them, very openly characterized slavery as rape, as brutal oppression, as barbaric. He talked about the lords of the lash and the lords of the loom, referring to the cotton lords of the North, the textile industry manufacturers. He didn't mince his words, and he regarded slavery as the most evil sin in the history of the world. And this is in the same time period as many of these slaveholders. So I think if we judge by their own times, they were regarded as just as evil as we might regard them today.
How would Sumner viewed Lee? You mentioned him. I was at his house in Washington, D.C. a few months ago. He clearly was, at least in a family sense, a decent man. What would Sumner have said about men like Lee?
When the Civil War began, there was a soldier from South Carolina who came to Sumner's doorstep. This is a Union soldier or an American soldier who comes to Sumner's doorstep to ask him for advice. And the soldier asked Sumner whether he should fight for South Carolina, which is his home, where his family is, where he's from, or if he should fight for the American flag, which is what he had sworn allegiance to as a soldier. And Sumner responds, "Read your commission, sir," telling him to read the military commission he received from the United States government. And the guy keeps saying, "Well, what if they start bombing my home? What if they do this? What if they do that?" And Sumner keeps responding, "Read your commission, sir." To Sumner would have said that Robert E. Lee had an oath, had a commission to the United States government, and by betraying it, had committed treason. And to Sumner, he was an extreme patriot, and any kind of treason to him was unforgivable. And so I don't think he would have ever recognized Robert E. Lee as an honorable man or as someone who had this kind of moral tensions in him. To Sumner, as far as Sumner was concerned, Robert E. Lee was a traitor to the American flag.
So the American Civil War for Sumner was a Manichaean struggle between good and evil.
Yeah, and he was very explicit about that. There's direct quotes where he said that war was a fight between right and wrong, between good and evil. To him, it very much was a Manichaean struggle. And what's striking about that is that from pretty much the beginning of the Civil War, I want to say in October or November of 1861, this is maybe 5 or 6 months after the first battle of the Civil War, Sumner says that the war has the potential to become the third great epoch in the history of America. The first epoch being Christopher Columbus's quote-unquote discovery of the Americas, the second epoch being the Revolutionary War, and the third epoch being the Civil War. And he says that it has a possibility of being of rising in moral grandeur even above the Revolutionary War, because what he saw the potential of the Civil War being was a liberation of more than 4 million enslaved African Americans in the South, which was more human beings than the entire population of America at the Revolution against Great Britain. So he saw the Civil War as an emancipatory war, as a war of freedom.
Zaakir, your book is already getting lots of great plaudits. Jefferson Cow, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Freedom's Dominion, said that it's a biography for our time, and that your story of Sumner brings, and I'm quoting Cowie here, the crux of the American project to life. This term, the American project, would it have made sense to Sumner? How did he think of, quote unquote, the American project?
So in his early years, as he started getting involved in the anti-slavery politics, he began as a Whig. The Whig political party was one of the two major political parties at the time, and Sumner insisted that he was distinguishing himself from many abolitionists who had this kind of anti-constitutional bias, for lack of a better term. So, for example, William Lloyd Garrison, perhaps the most famous American abolitionist, white abolitionist, one time on July 4th, the American Independence Day, was standing on a stage next to Sojourner Truth, a Black female abolitionist, and next to Henry David Thoreau, another famous abolitionist. And Garrison took the Constitution, a copy of the Constitution, and lit it on fire. Garrison described the Constitution as a covenant with death and an agreement with hell because it had compromises with slavery. Sumner distinguished himself from all this. Even though the Constitution was imperfect, he embraced it. And he once described his movement as a conservative movement. And he asked rhetorically in his speech, "What is this conservatism?" And he said, "It is the conservatism of 1776, founding the Declaration of Independence." To Sumner, his movement was an attempt to bring the Constitution in line with the Declaration of Independence, where Thomas Jefferson famously said that there's a self-evident truth that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. And to Sumner, this Jeffersonian ideal of human equality, enshrined in the Declaration, was the crux of the American project. And what he was trying to do, what he dedicated his career to, was to bring that American project to life and bring that statement, all men are created equal, to become true constitutionally, legally, and practically in America.
Of course, Jefferson himself is to be polite, a complicated person, a man perhaps who Sumner idealized intellectually, but of course also a slave owner, who for Sumner was the model of the founding father. We've done so many shows recently. We did one on Benjamin Franklin, Madison and Hamilton, of course. what was his view? You kind of present him in some ways as a later founder, but for Sumner, who was the model American founder?
He admired very much George Washington, and what stuck out to him about George Washington, not only, of course, Washington being a military genius, not only being the man who famously gave up his military commission so that civilian government might rule in America, who made democracy possible in many respects, but Sumner also regarded Washington as an abolitionist. Now, this is very striking because George Washington was an enslaver, had many slaves. He was one of the wealthiest men in America. He had these large tobacco plantations in Virginia. But when George Washington died, he emancipated all of his slaves in his will. And Sumner takes this and he gives a speech once where, not once, he does this repeatedly, both in public and in private. I looked in his private letters. I never found a moment where he criticized George Washington. And what he says about Washington was Washington on earth was a slaveholder, but Washington in heaven was an abolitionist. And he says that Washington went to God as an abolitionist. And so he would frequently cite George Washington as a moral example for having begun as a slaveholder, but having rid himself of slavery, freed his enslaved people. And Sumner's mission, he saw, was to kind of fulfill that Washingtonian inheritance by doing what Washington had done in his will, which was but expanding to the national scene, which is trying to find a way to emancipate all the enslaved people of America and make them all free.
Was Sumner a believer? You mentioned God.
He was. He is striking. He didn't go to church very much. And General Ulysses Grant, who becomes president, he didn't like Sumner very much. And someone once told Grant that Sumner did not believe in the Bible. And Grant responds, well, of course he doesn't. He didn't write it. So there's this old joke that Sumner didn't believe in the Bible because he didn't write it. And Sumner was he was a bit of an arrogant fellow. He loved his own writing, but he had a deep belief that God played an active role in human society. So, for example, in the 1850s, in the Senate, he's constantly warning Southern colleagues that if they keep doing what they're doing, God is going to punish America. He had this belief where he once said that God might one day punish America with a, quote, wicked, fratricidal, cruel war, a war never seen before in the annals of human history. And when that war began, Sumner continually evoked the Exodus narrative to explain the death and destruction that was taking place after each battle, whether it was Gettysburg, Antietam, Atlanta, Shiloh. Sumner, he said once that we have more to suffer, we have more plagues to endure before all will agree to, quote, let my people go. So he regarded the Civil War as this kind of divine intervention where God is punishing America up until the point that the Americans finally learned, like Pharaoh, the necessity of giving freedom to the enslaved people of society.
So the Civil War, of course, had a biblical quality, and for Sumner, I'm guessing the key text probably would have been the Old Testament rather than the New Testament in terms of this all-powerful God setting narratives to morally test humans.
That's right. He continually invoked the Old Testament stories, especially of Jeremiah, and a few other biblical prophets. I should also mention that he was a Unitarian. He did not believe, he rejected the Trinity. He grew up like his parents as a Unitarian, so he believed in the oneness of God and that Jesus was not quite necessarily a divine figure, but more of as a prophet of God.
He was also, and I know you deal with this in your narrative, he was gay. How central was this to his life, and is this something that he was public about? In any way?
Yeah, so I'm careful in how I present this in the book, in saying that I understand Sumner to be gay insofar as a modern term means much when applied to that time period. The term, the phrase, the word homosexuality was not effectively introduced into the English language until the 1870s by the writings of Sigmund Freud and others. So Sumner in his early life would not have had the whole concept of having an immutable sexual identity. You're bi, you're gay, you're straight. These are modern terms. They did not quite exist when Sumner was growing up. Now, that said, Sumner, he longed for love. He kept searching for it, and he felt like he could never seem to find it. He was one of the most dashing men in Boston at the time. He was one of the most eligible bachelors. And as he's searching, he meets this man named Samuel Gridley Howe. Samuel Howe and him become very close. They used to go on carriage rides together, looking for women, so to speak, and they never seemed to find anyone. They used to go on rides together in the countryside, come back home, go to a pub, order strawberries and cream, and then spend the whole night up just talking. They were
That
very
sounds very Freudian. Two men ordering strawberries and cream and talking all night.
right. You can't make this stuff up. Howe once fondly recalled Sumner with his waist straps unbuttoned, sitting in his armchair with a glass of Orvieto, a wine in his hands and a sweet smile on his lips. Howe ultimately does get married, and Sumner is heartbroken by this. He's just devastated. He goes into a period of depression. Howe feels terrible. Howe once writes that he felt like he went to heaven with his wife and left his best friend outside. Howe is so guilty that he spends his entire honeymoon writing letters to Sumner instead of spending time with his new wife. And his new wife, Julia, says Sumner ought to have been a woman and you to have married him. And so Sumner then pretty much spends the rest of his life lonely. He ultimately does get married in his 50s to a young widow. It's a disaster of a marriage. Within a few months, the widow, this woman, Alice, leaves Sumner and starts spreading rumors that he's sexually impotent. This didn't help because Sumner, for a while now, for decades had been a bachelor in Washington at a time when being a bachelor was considered a sort of suspect class. This is the influence of Victorian England in the United States, where bachelors were considered probably sexual perverts or were just somehow must have been debaucherous in their private life or what have you. And so Sumner felt this. He felt this sense of being looked down upon and outcasted for his bachelor status. And then, of course, when his wife leaves him and calls him sexually impotent, that doesn't help anyone at all.
I mean, there are some things about him that makes him, if not ludicrous, certainly an amusing fellow. But he was also remarkably brave. As I noted in the introduction, most school children still know him, if they do know him, as the man who was beaten on the floor of the Senate. Was he distinguished by his physical? I mean, clearly intellectually he was brave, but it's much easier to be intellectually brave than physically brave.
Sure. I've found very little evidence of Sumner exercising except going on walks. And yet he was 6'4", a kind of colossal figure, broad-shouldered, very strong physically. But he had never used a gun before. To my knowledge, he never got into a fight, at least except for the caning, where he just kind of was a receiver of a fight. He didn't really fight back. The caning is a striking story. Maybe shall we chat about it?
Of course. Let's this infamous caning on the floor of the Senate. It was on the floor of the Senate. Is that correct?
That's correct. So let's talk about the caning, and then let's talk about the speech that led to the caning. Let's start with the caning. So he gives this speech. He accuses one Southerner, Andrew Butler, of being a rapist, and I'm the first biographer to have found real evidence that charge was accurate.
When was the speech?
This is 1856, May of 1856. Actually, the 169th anniversary is coming up this Thursday of the caning. So he accuses Butler of being a rapist. Butler had a slave who in the 1920s gave some testimony where he recalled Butler having a mistress with 2 children. And so that's where the charge probably came from. So Sumner charges Butler with being a rapist. Butler had a nephew, Preston Brooks, who was a congressman. And this nephew, out of desire to kind of avenge his uncle's honor, comes up to Sumner in the Senate. He'd been telling people that he was going to challenge Sumner to a duel, but decides not to do that because duels are illegal in Washington and he didn't want to put himself up to legal liability. So ironically, beating him with the cane was legally less troublesome than challenging him to a duel. He tells people that he's going to ask Sumner for an apology, and Sumner doesn't give it, then he's going to attack him. He goes up to Sumner in the Senate. He doesn't ask for the apology. He doesn't ask him for a duel. Sumner didn't even know who he was. He didn't even know. It's unlikely he even knew that Butler had a nephew. He'd never seen this man before, Preston Brooks. Preston Brooks was in the House. Sumner was in the Senate. So Brooks comes up to him with a cane. and just starts whacking him over the head as hard as he can. The cane shatters into pieces as Brooks is attacking. Then Sumner, at some point, he forgets that he's in this chair that you have to kind of push back to get out. And so Sumner just starts to stand up, and he rips the desk, which is bolted into the ground, off its bolts. And then Brooks grabs him by the lapel, keeps beating him. Sumner reports going unconscious, and he's kind of flailing his arms around. He keeps beating him. Another senator, a Southerner actually, Crittenden, starts running towards Brooks and says, "Don't kill him, don't kill him." Brooks responds, "I do not intend to kill him. I only intend to flog him." Eventually, someone restrains Brooks. Someone else pulls back Sumner. Sumner collapses to the ground. He is soaking in blood. He had one injury over around here on the left side of above his ear that was nearly an inch deep. Another injury here that was also probably nearly an inch deep and an inch wide. To the skull. His skull is visible. He narrowly survives, but spends the next several years physically recovering.
He was an influential man. I mean, on top of the drama of this physical beating, he knew everybody at the time. He was friendly with de Tocqueville and Frederick Douglass and Lincoln, of course. But how influential politically was he? You talk in your book about his influence on the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, the 13th Amendment of 1864, the Freedmen's Bureau, which was set up in 1865, and then, of course, the Civil Rights Act of 1875. But had Preston Brooks killed Sumner on the floor, which he got close to, as you note, would it have made any difference to history, to American history?
So on the one hand, Sumner is the loudest, most passionate, and most aggressive political spokesman of abolition, civil rights, and most of the pieces of legislation that you just described. On the other hand, he's not a particularly effective legislator. He's very strong-willed. He's very principled in his own way. He refused to ever engage in backroom deal-making. Carl Schurz, another senator, once said that Sumner was the kind of man who, if he fought you with his full chest right in front of you. So he would fight people routinely in the Senate. He would just call them out, even if they were friends. He wasn't particularly good at the deal-making that goes into politics. Now, I found this very striking, of course, and I thought Sumner was oblivious to it, oblivious to his own faults. And then I find one of his secretaries once asked him about him being an ineffective legislator. And he responds and tells his secretary, "Have you ever heard of the cuckoo bird?" So I'm wondering, what is the cuckoo bird doing in this story? And I look into the cuckoo bird. So a mother cuckoo bird doesn't raise her own eggs. She drops off her eggs into the basket, into the nests of other birds, and then sometimes will go and attack those birds if they refuse to raise the cuckoo eggs as her own, and sometimes confuses other birds who think that the cuckoo bird will come in, she'll take out the dove's other eggs, put her own eggs in, then the dove comes back and confuses her own eggs for the cuckoo bird's eggs. And so Sumner explains this to his secretary, effectively comparing himself to a mother cuckoo bird, and says the mother cuckoo bird is the smartest of all birds. She is content to hatch to drop these eggs, not to raise them. And for Sumner, he was similar, where he had these big ideas and he kind of wanted to just keep pushing them in the abstract and allow other people to deal with the nitty gritty of getting them passed and the particulars of the legislation.
What's your inspiration here? You just graduated from Zaakir from Yale Law School. You've dedicated a lot of your legal work to antitrust. On X, you retweeted a comment about Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor being the inspirations for a new generation of lawyers. You've written on antitrust. How has Sumner's life influenced your life as a lawyer, both as a student and now having graduated from Yale, focusing on legal struggles? Is antitrust the anti-slavery of the 21st century?
I wouldn't go that far. I think antitrust is very important, but it's hard to compare anything to Southern slavery. Sumner did have a political economy approach to slavery. A lot of abolitionists were just kind of pietistic about it. Slavery was bad because it was an affront to God, and they had this sympathy for Black Americans, but it didn't extend into kind of any kind of vision of equal rights or into any kind of serious economic critique of the slave system. Sumner, by contrast, he often characterized slavery as the quote slave oligarchy. To him, slavery was a system of domination, but it was also a system of exploitation by a small fraction of the population against everybody else. So Sumner, he gives us one speech on the slave oligarchy, where he goes into the statistics and he shows that approximately 0.5% of the population, less than 100,000 slaveholders, were the only people who had more than 2 slaves. And so you have this small fraction of the population that's dominating all of American politics, all of the American economy, sucking up the resources, sucking up investment that could be going to other industries. And so he has this economic critique of slavery. And we have similar oligarchical problems today, but I'm not saying the slave oligarchs of then are similar to what we have now. I think separately, for me and for my own thinking as a young lawyer, I stumbled on Sumner's graduation speech that he gave at Howard Law School. So for those who don't know, Howard is historically Black university. It was founded in the 1870s. It's not only the first, Howard's Law School is not only the first law school in the country open to African Americans, it's also the first law school open to women. Sumner plays a key role in founding Howard Law School. When Howard invited him to be the first graduating speaker at Howard, he was already committed to speak at Columbia. And then he withdraws his Columbia invitation, which probably came with a large honorarium, and instead goes to Howard. And at graduation, he speaks to these young law students, or these graduating law students, and he tells them that, quote, to be a good lawyer, you must be a good man. Drawing from Cicero, who said that to be a good orator, you must be a good man. And so he calls on these young attorneys to dedicate their lives and to use their talents to fight for civil rights. And this is really striking because this is at a time when civil rights as a concept barely exists. And so he's kind of at this forefront of re-envisioning what a lawyer can be in society. He is expounding this idea to everyone that he can. As late life, he is spending time mentoring young lawyers, including, one young man who becomes the first graduate of Harvard College, Black graduate of Harvard College, becomes one of America's senior diplomats. Another young man who becomes a white young lawyer who becomes the first president of NAACP. Another young lawyer who helps him in the case to integrate Boston schools. And so he's kind of everywhere when it comes to mentoring a new generation of lawyers who go on to fight for civil rights and equal liberty.
This brings us back to the beginning, the issue of moral ambition. You talk about becoming a good man and mentoring. You and I are both friends with Judy Goldstein, a remarkable woman, the founder of an amazing organization called Humanity in Action, which morally mentors young people. You're a senior fellow. You've been involved with them. Zaakir, do we need more organizations like Humanity in Action and more people like Judy Goldstein who are focused on bringing the moral ambition out of not just young Americans, but young people all over the world?
We do. Judy, so Judy founds Humanity in Action, as you know, which is a program that when I was in college, Humanity in Action took me to Berlin, Germany, with a cohort of students from Poland, Ukraine, Greece, Italy, the United States, and even we had one student from Syria. And together we were learning about the history of human rights struggles in Germany. We visited concentration camps and labor camps from the Third Reich. We learned about the history of anti-Semitism, bigotry, anti-Turkish sentiment in Germany today. And that was such a formative experience because what Judy has created is a program that takes people with these young talents and urges them to consider, like, Do we need more consultants in society? Do we need more bankers? Maybe we do.
It's the Bregman concern,
It's
isn't it? To save
exactly.
elites from their wasted lives. And Bregman's trying to do it, but Judy's already done it. I think she's probably more effective than Bregman.
Right. I think Bregman articulates the philosophy that Judy has lived by for the last few decades. And so Judy also, interestingly, she's a historian by training. And at some point, she kind of stepped out of the academy to just train a new generations of people to actually take the lessons of history and implement them into their own lives. And so I'm so grateful for her, because if it wasn't for her, I don't know if this book would have ever happened.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to make Judy blush too much, and I'm not suggesting that she's the Charles Sumner of the 21st century, but this moral ambition is so important, Zaakir, especially in 2025 in America, isn't it?
It is, and I think the thing that Judy also recognized is the power and the importance of mentorship. I thought it was so striking in Sumner's life that Sumner, in old age, as he's a U.S. senator, as he's got plenty to do, he is still. I mean, yeah, how many senators today would take hours out of their day to spend with law students or spend with other young people because they see it as a priority? And what's striking is Sumner, in his young age, he was mentored by so many people, and I think he internalized the value of that. So let's give you one quick story. When he's in his late 20s, he goes to New York and he stays at the home of Chancellor Kent. Chancellor James Kent, he's often referred to as the American Blackstone. He's this great American jurist. And Kent, spends a lot of time with Sumner, shows him all his books, spends mentoring Sumner, and he takes him upstairs to stay at his home, and he looks at the room to make sure that's neat and tidy. And Kent tells Sumner that when he was young, Alexander Hamilton did the same for him. Hamilton would host Kent at his home and make sure the room was neat and tidy. Now, fast forward a few decades. Sumner, in the early 1870s, there's a young law student from Harvard who drops out and becomes Sumner's private secretary named Wilfred Story. And Sumner takes Story upstairs, shows him the room, makes sure it's neat and tidy, and tells him that when he was young, Kent had done it for him. When Kent was done, Hamilton had done it for him. And so, in other words, no pressure, as he's telling the story. Story goes on and becomes the first president of the NAACP. So it's this extraordinary chain of mentorship from Alexander Hamilton to Chancellor Kent to Charles Sumner to Wilfred Story to the modern day NAACP.
Yeah, it's quite a story. And your book, your new book, Zaakir, Charles Sumner, Conscience of a Nation, is a remarkable achievement, especially for someone as young as yourself. I do have to ask this. Are you peaking a bit early? You're going to have a major new book, a biography. You're not even 30. You're a lawyer. You just graduated from Yale Law School. What's the rest of Zaakir Tameez's life going to look like?
That's a great question. Maybe this is it. Maybe I call it quits right here. Writing a book was terribly fun, but also terribly exhausting, especially doing it in law school. I spent the past few months trying to write again, and so far it has gone nowhere. So who knows? I may be a one-hit wonder, but I'm certainly thinking and reflecting and trying to come up with the next big project.
Yeah, I very much doubt, Zaakir, you are a one-hit wonder, and we'll get you back on the show with your next hit. Congratulations on the book. It's a wonderful read and an important read. So important to have both these days. Charles Sumner, Conscience of a Nation, by our guest Zaakir Tameez. It's his first book, and I hope the first of many. Thank you so much, Zaakir.
Thank you, Andrew.